I transferred $967,430 from our family accounts while my daughter and her husband were meeting with an attorney about having me declared incompetent. The confirmation emails arrived one after another as I sat in this sparsely furnished apartment, my new home. Not our family home of 43 years where Margaret and I raised our children, but a simple 2-bedroom unit in Westridge Gardens that nobody knows about. The kind of place people my age are expected to quietly disappear into. The laptop screen glowed in the dim evening light. I hadn't bothered turning on more than the small desk lamp. Didn't need to. The numbers on the screen told me everything I needed to know. The transfers had gone through without a hitch. Checking account, savings, investment portfolio. All of it moved to the new accounts I'd set up 3 weeks ago when I first discovered what they were planning. I'm not a wealthy man by today's standards, just comfortable after a lifetime of careful decisions. The house was paid off 15 years ago. Margaret and I had planned well for retirement before cancer took her. We'd wanted to leave something meaningful for Rebecca and her family. Funny how things change. The apartment feels empty, but I brought what matters. My reading chair, Margaret's quilt, the small oak desk that's been with me since my first job. A few photographs, though not the ones Rebecca might recognize if she ever found this place. The essentials of a life pared down. At 72, you learn what's truly necessary. I close the laptop and walk to the window. The view isn't much. Just the parking lot, and beyond that, a small community garden where some residents tend vegetables and flowers. Nothing like the maple-lined street I'd watched change through seasons for decades. But there's a certain peace in anonymity. No one here knows me as poor Frank who's losing his grip, or Rebecca's dad who needs looking after. The irony doesn't escape me. They think I'm incapable of managing my affairs, yet I executed this plan with precision while they laid their groundwork. 3 separate banks, 2 financial advisors, a modest apartment lease signed under a holding company I established years ago for a small business venture. All arranged methodically, legally, and without arousing suspicion. I'm not angry. That's what surprises me most. There's a hollow feeling where anger should be, perhaps disappointment, perhaps grief, but not the rage one might expect when discovering your only child and her husband have been systematically documenting your cognitive decline, selectively recording moments of confusion while ignoring the clarity that still dominates my days. The phone on the side table hasn't rung. It will, though. Soon enough, they'll discover the accounts are empty. They'll panic, then rage. They'll call my old number repeatedly, not knowing I left that phone in the nightstand drawer at the house, powered off. They don't have this number. Nobody does, except my attorney. I made tea and settled into my chair, Margaret's quilt across my lap, despite the mild evening. Some habits provide comfort, even when unnecessary. Tomorrow, I'll need to start making arrangements for what comes next. But tonight, I allowed myself this moment of quiet reflection. I never imagined I'd be here, hiding from my own family, protecting what's mine from those I once trusted most. The betrayal didn't happen overnight. Looking back, I can see the signs I missed, the conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, the concerned glances exchanged over holiday dinners, the slow, deliberate construction of a narrative about my declining health. What they don't know, what they never bothered to truly understand, is that I've been paying attention all along, and I've learned more about them than they ever intended to reveal. It was a Tuesday evening in late October when everything changed. I remember because the maple outside my living room window had just turned that perfect shade of burnt orange, and I'd spent the afternoon raking leaves into neat piles that the wind would inevitably scatter by morning. My arthritis was acting up, but the satisfaction of maintaining my own property, the home where I'd lived for 43 years, made the pain worthwhile. The house was quiet that evening. I'd settled into my recliner with a cup of tea and the crossword puzzle, something I'd done almost every evening since Margaret passed 3 years ago. The familiar routine was comforting, even if the silence sometimes felt heavy. When my phone rang and I saw Diane's name on the screen, I felt that small surge of happiness I always get when my daughter calls. "Dad, hi, how are you feeling today?" Her voice had that slightly elevated pitch she uses when she's checking up on me. We chatted briefly about my doctor's appointment earlier that week, just a routine checkup, where they'd adjusted my blood pressure medication, nothing serious despite her concerned tone. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Doctor says I'm doing well for 72. I filled in 12 across. Tenacious. 7 letters. "That's good to hear. Listen, I need to grab something for Emma. Can I call you back in 5 minutes? "Of course," I said, but she had already put the phone down. I was about to hang up when I realized the call was still connected. I could hear rustling, then footsteps, and then Diane's voice again, but different, sharper, more businesslike. "C'est me." Finally talked to him. He sounds okay today, but you know how it goes. One day lucid, the next day he's leaving the stove on. I froze, pencil hovering over 23 down. That had happened exactly once, 6 months ago, when the timer on my kettle malfunctioned. A man's voice, my son-in-law Robert, responded. "Did you mention Sunny Pines to him yet?" "Not yet. I'm working up to it. You know how stubborn he is about the house." My hand began to tremble. Sunny Pines was an assisted living facility across town. Margaret and I had visited a friend there once. The corridors smelled of disinfectant and despair. "We need to move on this, Di. The real estate market is hot right now. That house could easily go for $450, maybe $500,000 in this market. That's college for the kids and pays for his care with plenty left over." My throat constricted. They were planning to sell my home, the home I'd built with Margaret, where we'd raised our children, where every corner held a memory. I know. Diane sighed. "Dad's just living in the past. He can't maintain that place anymore, and honestly, it's becoming a liability. Remember when he fell on the porch steps last winter? A minor slip on a patch of ice. I'd caught myself on the railing." "Look," Robert's voice lowered. "If he won't agree, we might need to talk to Dr. Winters about competency. Your name is already on his accounts as power of attorney for health care. We could—" I hate to go behind his back, but Diane's voice trailed off. "Maybe you're right. He's just one old man rattling around in that big house. It doesn't make sense anymore." One old man. The words echoed in my head as my crossword puzzle slipped from my lap to the floor. My own daughter plotting to declare me incompetent, to strip away my independence, to sell the home that was my last connection to Margaret. So, I sat perfectly still as they continued discussing the practical aspects of moving me out, as if I were a piece of furniture to be relocated. My tea grew cold. My hands, which had been shaking, gradually steadied. When I finally heard Diane say, "Oh God, the call," and the line went dead, I didn't move for a long time. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical pain I'd ever experienced. My own child, my own flesh and blood. But as the shock began to recede, something else took its place. Not just anger, though there was plenty of that. It was determination, a steely resolve I hadn't felt in years. They thought I was just one old man, too feeble to manage my own affairs. They had severely underestimated me. I picked up my fallen crossword, found my place again, and filled in 23 down. Resilient. 9 letters. I knew I needed to act quickly. Tomorrow I would start making calls of my own. Looking back, I can trace every callus on my hands to something I built for my family. Every ache in my lower back to hours spent hunched over blueprints or bent under sinks. The arthritis that now stiffens my fingers each morning, that came from 30 years of gripping tools after my regular shift ended, when most men my age were settling into recliners. When Melissa was accepted to State University, I remember the pride swelling in my chest, and the panic that followed when we saw the tuition bill. Sarah and I had saved, but not enough, so I picked up night shifts at the processing plant. For 4 years, I'd work my regular construction job from 7 to 4, grab a sandwich in my truck, then clock in at the plant from 5 to midnight. My hands would be raw from the chemicals, my eyes burning. I'd get home, shower off the smell of industrial cleaners, and collapse into bed for 5 hours before starting again. I still remember how the steering wheel felt under my palms during those midnight drives home, the leather cracked from my dried-out skin, my fingers sometimes too numb to change the radio station. But Melissa graduated without a penny of debt. "Dad's gift to me," she'd tell her friends, though I noticed how easily the sacrifice became an anecdote at dinner parties as the years passed. When she and Robert wanted to buy their first home in 2008, the market had just crashed. They found a fixer-upper with good bones but needed help with the down payment. Sarah and I had been saving for a kitchen remodel. Our cabinets were original to the house and literally falling apart. But we wrote them a check instead. I still have the same laminate countertops, still fix the cabinet door that won't stay closed with a piece of folded cardboard. Then came 2011, when Robert lost his job during the recession. For 14 months, we covered their mortgage payments while they regrouped. I postponed my knee surgery twice that year. By the time I finally had it done, the doctor said the delay had caused permanent damage. That's why I still favor my right leg when I climb stairs. Every step a small reminder of that choice. But this house, this was my masterpiece. I built it plank by plank, nail by nail over 7 years. After my regular workday, I'd come to this plot of land we'd saved for and work until darkness made it impossible to see. Weekends disappeared into foundation work, framing, plumbing, electrical. I can still feel the weight of the roof beams as we hoisted them into place. My buddy Mike and I, our shoulders burning, legs trembling with the effort. I remember the satisfaction of installing the kitchen cabinets I'd built in our garage during winter evenings, my breath visible in the cold as I measured and cut. My hands would crack and bleed in the winter. Sarah would rub balm into them at night, wincing at the splits in my skin. "You're working too hard," she'd say. But I had this vision of passing something substantial to Melissa someday, something built with care, something that would shelter generations of our family. I never talked much about these sacrifices. It wasn't my style to enumerate what I'd given up or how hard I'd worked. I figured the results spoke for themselves. The house, the college education, the financial safety net always there when they needed it. So when I overheard Melissa and Robert in our kitchen last Thanksgiving, casually discussing how they'd update everything once the place was theirs, how they'd finally bring it into this century, I felt something crack inside me. They were leaning against the counter I'd installed with these hands, planning to tear out the craftsmanship I'd poured my life into, speaking as if my decades of work were just an inconvenience to be corrected. Yumpis. It was the casualness that cut deepest, the entitled certainty that this would all be theirs to dismantle. As if the house and all it represented was already gone from my hands into theirs. That's when I first began to wonder what else they might be taking for granted, what other plans they might be making around my life's work. It's amazing how clearly you can see things once your eyes are truly open, like watching a movie for the second time and noticing all the clues you missed. After finding those documents, I started replaying conversations in my mind, moments that had left me with a vague unease but that I'd brushed aside. Now they formed a pattern I couldn't unsee. There was that time last month when I walked into the kitchen to get some water and caught the tail end of Mark's phone conversation. "No, we've got it handled. The old man doesn't need to worry about it," he'd said, lowering his voice when he noticed me. He'd smiled broadly, clapping me on the shoulder. "Just talking about that plumbing issue, Frank. All taken care of." I'd thanked him then. Now I wondered what it really was that I supposedly didn't need to worry about. Or the way Diane would exchange glances with Mark whenever I mentioned wanting to take a trip or make a large purchase. That subtle eye communication that passed between them, a language of raised eyebrows and tight smiles, I wasn't meant to decode. "Dad, let's talk about that later," she'd say, her voice taking on that particular tone, the one you use with children who don't understand the complexities of adult decisions. But it was that dinner 3 weeks ago that now stood out most clearly in my memory. They'd invited me over on a Thursday evening, Unusual, since our family dinners were typically on Sundays. Diane had made my favorite pot roast, and Mark had opened a bottle of good scotch. I should have recognized the setup for what it was. "So, Frank," Mark had said after pouring me a second drink, "Diane and I have been thinking about your finances." He'd used that slow, over-enunciated speech pattern as if I might have trouble following standard conversation. "With the market being what it is, we think it might be time to consolidate some of your investments." Diane had nodded enthusiastically. "It's just that we worry, Dad. Managing all those accounts must be overwhelming for you." "I've been managing my money for 68 years, I'd replied mildly. "Haven't missed a bill yet." "Shown." Mark had laughed too loudly. "Of course, Frank, you've always been sharp, but retirement planning gets complicated. Tax implications, required minimum distributions. It's a lot for anyone to handle." "Pandio." "What Mark means," Diane had jumped in, patting my hand, "is that we want to help. You shouldn't have to worry about these things at your age." At my age, as if I'd somehow lost my faculties along with my hair. I'd smiled and nodded, changing the subject to my grandson's baseball tournament. But now I remembered how they'd exchanged that look again when I declined their offer, that mixture of frustration and determination that said they weren't finished trying. Later that night, I'd overheard them in the kitchen as I returned from the bathroom. "He's just being stubborn," Mark had whispered. "He doesn't understand what's best for him anymore." "Charles." "I know," Diane had sighed, "but we need to be patient. Dad's always been independent. We just need to make him think it's his idea." "Shay." I'd quietly returned to the living room, telling myself they meant well, that they were concerned about me. But now, with those documents in hand, their words took on a different meaning entirely. I sat at my kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold beside me. I didn't slam my fist or curse their names. That's not my way. Instead, I felt a calm clarity settling over me. I'd spent decades building my life, making careful decisions, planning for my future. I wasn't about to let anyone, not even my own daughter, take that away from me because they thought I was too old to notice. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts. I needed to make some calls, starting with my attorney. It was time to protect what was mine, not with anger, but with the quiet determination that had served me well my entire life. I've never been one to make hasty decisions. 35 years as a structural engineer taught me that proper planning prevents poor performance. So the morning after discovering Richard's betrayal, I made an appointment with Patricia Holden, an attorney who specialized in property law. I'd met her years ago when I served on the Neighborhood Association board. She agreed to see me that afternoon. Her office smelled of leather and lemon polish. I laid out the situation methodically, the house I'd built with my own hands, Richard's unexpected departure, and the discovery of his plan to force a sale. Patricia listened intently, occasionally jotting notes on a yellow legal pad. "Let me be clear about your situation, Walter," she said when I finished. "Since you purchased the property before your marriage and maintained it as separate property in your estate planning, Richard has no legal claim to ownership. However, given his residency and the improvements you've made together, he could potentially claim some interest in the increased value." She tapped her pen against the desk. "If you want to protect your investment, selling quickly before he can file any claims would be prudent. The longer this drags on, the messier it could get." "Tinas." I nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. "That's what I thought. I just needed to hear it from someone who knows the law." That evening, I pulled out my old engineering notebook and approached this like any other project. I created a decision matrix with columns for timing, financial outcomes, and emotional impact. The conclusion was clear. Selling quickly was the optimal solution. I'd built this house to share with someone who loved it as much as I did. Now it just felt like four walls holding memories that cut like glass. The next morning, I called Diane Mercer, a real estate agent who advertised her specialty in expedited sales. She arrived promptly at 2 p.m., clipboard in hand, professional but warm. As we walked through the house, I found myself pointing out all the custom features I'd designed and built, things I'd always taken pride in, but now felt like artifacts from another life. "This kitchen island," I explained, running my hand along the edge of the butcher block countertop. "I milled this from a single maple tree that fell during that big storm in '98. Took me 3 weekends to get the finish just right." I didn't mention how Richard had helped me sand it, or how we'd celebrated its completion with a bottle of champagne. In the living room, Diane admired the built-in bookcases that flanked the fireplace. "These are extraordinary craftsmanship," she said. "I designed them with a slight curve to match the natural light patterns through the day," I explained. "The shelves are adjustable, but I calculated the standard heights based on average book dimensions from my collection." We moved to the back patio, where the pergola I'd designed created geometric shadows across the stonework. I'd installed a drainage system beneath the pavers that directed rainwater to the garden beds, the kind of practical detail that gave me satisfaction, but visitors rarely noticed. After completing her assessment, Diane sat with me at the dining table, another piece I'd built myself from reclaimed barnwood. She presented her marketing strategy and recommended listing price, which was higher than I'd expected. "Custom features like yours add significant value," she explained, "especially with the craftsmanship you've put into this place." I signed the listing agreement with a steady hand, though my heart felt anything but steady. The pen felt heavy as I traced my signature on the line, the same signature that had appeared on the original property deed 30 years earlier. As I handed the papers back to Diane, I realized I'd just taken the first irreversible step toward closing this chapter of my life. "We'll have this listed by tomorrow," she said, "and I've already got a few potential buyers in mind." Melissa started calling every day after our confrontation. Not just quick check-ins, but long, probing conversations that danced around what she really wanted to know. "Dad, I was thinking about stopping by this weekend. Maybe we could go through some of those old photo albums? Or, have you thought any more about what we discussed regarding the house?" Each call felt like a chess match where I had to calculate 3 moves ahead. I kept my responses casual but vague. "This weekend might be tricky, honey. I've got a doctor's appointment." There was no appointment, but I needed time. When she asked about the house, I'd sigh and say, "I'm still processing everything. Let's talk about it later." I could hear the frustration in her voice, the slight edge that hadn't been there before our confrontation. Meanwhile, I was moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew time was running short. I visited First National across town, where nobody knew me as Richard and Martha's widower. The young banker, Kevin, helped me open new accounts without the probing questions I'd get at my regular branch where I'd banked for 30 years. I transferred modest amounts daily, not enough to trigger any alerts, but enough that within a week I'd moved nearly half my accessible funds. "Planning a big change, sir?" Kevin had asked as he processed my paperwork. "Just diversifying," I'd answered, with a smile that revealed nothing. At home, I worked methodically, starting with the attic. I sorted through boxes of memories, selecting only what was irreplaceable. Martha's handwritten recipe cards, yellowed with age and splattered with decades of cooking. The small wooden box containing locks of hair from each of my children's first haircuts. The letters Martha and I exchanged during my brief military service before we married. These treasures went into a single sturdy suitcase I kept in my closet, easily accessible but out of sight. The locksmith arrived on a Tuesday when I knew Melissa would be at work. Mr. Gaines was an older gentleman who didn't ask questions when I requested all new locks, including the back door that hadn't been rekeyed since we bought the house in 1978. "Lost the spare set," I explained anyway, feeling a need to justify myself. "Happens all the time," he said, focusing on the door hardware. "Better safe than sorry." As he worked, my phone rang. Melissa again. I stepped onto the back porch to take the call, keeping my voice light. "Hey, sweetheart. How's your day going?" "Fine, Dad. Listen, I was thinking of bringing dinner over tonight, maybe around 6? My heart skipped. The locksmith would be gone by then. but the new keys sitting on my counter would raise immediate questions. Oh, that's thoughtful, but I actually made plans with Bob from the senior center. Rain check? A pause. You've been busy lately. Everything okay? Of course, I said, watching through the window as Mr. Gaines finished with the front door. Just keeping active. Doctor's orders. After hanging up, I paid the locksmith and tucked the new keys into my pocket. As I was showing him out, a car slowed in front of the house. My stomach dropped when I recognized my son-in-law's sedan. He wasn't supposed to be here. He worked across town. The car continued down the street, but the message was clear. They were checking on me. That night, I sorted through financial records at my dining room table, organizing everything I would need and shredding what I wouldn't. The grandfather clock in the hallway, the one Martha had inherited from her parents, ticked loudly in the quiet house, each sound a reminder that my timeline was compressing. I had maybe 2 weeks before they would make another move regarding the house. As I worked, I realized I needed to accelerate my timeline. The next morning, I would need to contact a realtor, not the one Melissa and her husband had suggested, but someone with no connection to my family, someone who understood discretion and could move quickly. The house that had been my anchor for decades was about to become my ticket to freedom. I wrote the letter at my kitchen table, the same place where I'd signed the mortgage papers 32 years ago. 3 drafts later, I had something that stated the facts without venom. No accusations, no name-calling, just the truth. I explained how I discovered their scheme to force me out, including the falsified building inspection reports and the backdated property tax notices. I detailed how I'd legally transferred ownership to a trust I controlled, changed the locks, and installed a security system that would alert me to any attempts at forced entry. I informed them that I had already filed complaints with the State Licensing Board, the District Attorney's Office, and the Real Estate Commission. The letter wasn't about revenge, it was about consequences. Actions have them, and my son-in-law and daughter had chosen theirs. I made it clear that I was willing to discuss a fair resolution, but on my terms, not theirs. I included my attorney's contact information and a copy of the trust documents. The final line simply read, "I raised you to be better than this, Margaret." Driving to the house one last time felt strange. The neighborhood looked the same as it had for decades. The Johnsons' maple tree still dominated the corner. Mrs. Petrovich's garden still overflowed with tomato plants. But everything felt different, knowing I wouldn't be coming back. I parked across the street rather than in the driveway. No sense in announcing my presence. The key still worked in the front door lock, though it would be the last time. I'd had the locks changed that morning. Inside, the house echoed with emptiness. I'd removed my personal belongings over the past week, quietly and methodically. The furniture remained. Technically, it belonged to the trust now. The hardwood floors creaked in all the familiar places as I walked through the living room where Margaret had taken her first steps. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the coffee I'd brewed that morning before the movers came for the last of my things. I placed the envelope on the kitchen counter where they couldn't miss it, propped against the fruit bowl that had been a wedding gift from my late wife's mother. Then I took out the small wireless camera I'd purchased. Nothing fancy, just enough to let me see their reaction when they discovered what I'd done. I positioned it on the bookshelf in the living room, angled toward the kitchen entrance, and tested the connection on my phone. The image was clear. Before leaving, I allowed myself one final walk through the house. The afternoon light slanted through the windows in the way that had always made the dining room glow golden around 4 o'clock. I ran my hand along the doorframe where we'd marked Margaret's height every birthday until she turned 18. My fingertips found the small dent in the hallway wall where I'd once lost my balance carrying a Christmas tree. Every scratch and imperfection told a story. Our story. In the master bedroom, I stood for a long moment, remembering Helen, how she'd arranged the furniture to catch the morning light for reading, how she'd insisted on the pale blue paint that I'd thought too cold but had grown to love. "This is the right thing," I whispered, as if she could hear me. They left me no choice. I locked the front door behind me for the last time and slipped the new keys into my pocket. From my car, I watched the house, my house, for several minutes before driving away. I didn't cry. I was past that now. 3 hours later, sitting in my new apartment with a cup of tea, I watched on my phone as Margaret and Richard returned. I could see their confusion as their key failed to work in the lock. Richard tried again, then again more forcefully. They disappeared from view, presumably trying the back door. When they reappeared, Margaret was on her phone, calling a locksmith, I guessed. Eventually, Richard noticed something through the window and pointed. They disappeared again, returning with a spare key they must have hidden somewhere on the property. That one wouldn't work either. Finally, Richard broke a small pane in the back door. I'd anticipated this and already filed a police report for breaking and entering. They entered the kitchen, and I watched as Margaret found the envelope. Her face changed as she read, from confusion to disbelief to something harder. She handed the letter to Richard, whose face reddened as he scanned the pages. When he crumpled the letter and threw it across the room, I turned off the feed. I'd seen enough. Now it was time to let my attorney handle the next steps. The next morning, I settled into my study with a cup of coffee and opened my laptop to check the surveillance feed. I wasn't proud of installing cameras in my own home, but given what I'd discovered, it seemed a necessary precaution. What I witnessed over the next few hours was like watching a house of cards collapse in slow motion. Melissa and Craig arrived around 10, letting themselves in with the key I'd never asked them to return. They went straight to the office where they'd hidden the documents. The moment they discovered the empty drawer, panic set in. Craig frantically rifled through every folder while Melissa stood frozen, her hand over her mouth. "They're gone. Everything's gone," Craig said, his voice rising. "The power of attorney, the trust documents, everything." "Did you check the safe?" Melissa asked, her voice trembling. "Of course I checked. It's all gone. Your father must have found them." What followed was a heated argument that revealed far more than they intended. Their voices carried clearly through my speakers as they paced around my living room, their carefully constructed facade crumbling by the minute. "What are we going to do?" Melissa's voice cracked. "The lease on our apartment is up next month, and we have nowhere to go. We're already 3 months behind on payments." "Don't you think I know that?" Craig snapped. "The credit cards are maxed out. We've got the bank calling every day about the second mortgage, and now this." I took a slow sip of my coffee. There was no joy in watching my daughter's distress, just a somber recognition that consequences were finally catching up. I'd suspected their finances were strained. The flashy cars and expensive clothes never quite added up with Craig's sporadic employment, but I hadn't realized how desperate their situation had become. "Maybe if you hadn't lost your job again," Melissa hissed, "we wouldn't be in this mess." "That wasn't my fault, and I told you, I've got prospects. That startup is going to call any day now." "You've been saying that for months. Meanwhile, we've been counting on Dad's money to bail us out." Craig pulled out his phone and stepped away, speaking in hushed tones. When he returned, his face had lost all color. "I just spoke to Jim," he said, referring to a lawyer friend they occasionally consulted. "He says if your father revoked the power of attorney and found the trust documents before we could file them, there's nothing we can do. Legally, we're screwed." Melissa collapsed onto my sofa, the one I'd bought with Martha 40 years ago. "Call someone else. There has to be something we can do." Over the next hour, they made call after call, each one ending with the same conclusion. Without my signature on properly executed documents, they had no claim to my assets. One attorney was particularly blunt. I could hear his voice through Craig's speakerphone explaining that what they had attempted could potentially be considered elder fraud. "You need to stop calling people," the voice advised. "If your father decides to press charges, these conversations won't look good." Phew. I felt no vindictive pleasure watching them unravel, just a profound sadness mixed with relief. This wasn't about revenge, it was about justice, for myself and for Martha's memory. Our life's work wouldn't be squandered by their recklessness. Before they left, Melissa stood in the center of the living room, looking around as if seeing the house for the last time. "What are we going to tell the kids?" she whispered. "We promised them so much." That question lingered with me long after they departed. My grandchildren, innocent in all this, yet inevitably affected. I closed the laptop and gazed out the window at Martha's garden. I knew what needed to be done next, and it wouldn't be easy for any of us. I was washing dishes when the doorbell rang. 3 weeks in my new apartment, and I hadn't told anyone my address except for my sister Marge. The sound made my stomach tighten. I dried my hands, walked to the door, and peered through the peephole. There they stood, Rebecca and Daniel, their faces a mixture of anger and indignation. I took a deep breath before opening the door. "How did you find me?" I asked, not bothering with pleasantries. "Mom, what the hell?" Rebecca pushed past me into the apartment. Daniel followed, his hands in his pockets, eyes darting around my modest new space. "You disappear, you don't answer our calls, you empty the joint account, and you're asking how we found you?" "Marge wouldn't tell us," Daniel said, his voice tight. "We had to hire someone." Of course they did. I closed the door and turned to face them, keeping my voice steady. "I needed space. I think you know why." Rebecca threw her hands up. "No, Mom, we don't know why. You've completely lost your mind. Dad's been gone 3 years, and suddenly you're having some kind of breakdown?" I moved to my small kitchen table and sat down. "Please sit if you want to talk." They remained standing. "I know about the money, Rebecca. I know about the trust, the accounts, everything." So, their expressions shifted almost imperceptibly. Daniel's jaw tightened. Rebecca crossed her arms. "What are you talking about?" she asked, but her voice had lost its edge. "I have the paperwork. I've spoken with the bank. I know you've been siphoning money from my accounts for over a year. I know about the forged signatures." Daniel stepped forward. "Look, Janet, you're clearly confused. We were helping you manage things. You've been struggling since Robert died." "Don't." My voice was quiet but firm. "Don't insult me by lying more. I'm not confused. I'm not senile. I'm not grieving to the point of delusion. I know exactly what you've done." Rebecca's strategy shifted instantly. Her eyes welled with tears. "Mom, we were trying to protect you. You've been making such strange decisions lately. We were worried." "You were worried about my money," I corrected her, "not about me." Daniel's face darkened. "You know what? Fine. We did move some money around, but it was for your own good, and technically that money is Rebecca's inheritance anyway. Chapeau, not until I'm dead, it isn't." I kept my voice level. "And last I checked, I'm very much alive." Rebecca's tears vanished as quickly as they'd appeared. "Do you have any idea what you've done? We have the kids' private school tuition due. We have the lake house payments. We had plans for that money." My money, I reminded her. My retirement, my security." Daniel stepped closer, his voice dropping to something between a threat and a plea. "Janet, be reasonable. We can work this out. But if you push this, involve lawyers, you'll never see the grandkids again. Is that what you want?" The threat stung, but I'd prepared myself for it. "That's your choice to make. But here's mine. I will not be manipulated, stolen from, or threatened by my own family." "Carlos," Rebecca began to pace. "This is insane. You're throwing away your family over some accounting misunderstanding." It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a betrayal. I finally stood up. "Here's what happens now. You have one path forward with me. Acknowledge what you did, apologize sincerely, and accept the consequences. That means paying back what you took and rebuilding trust over time." "Or what?" Daniel scoffed. "Or we don't have a relationship." The words hurt to say, but I kept my voice steady. "I won't have people in my life who see me as a bank account rather than a mother. I won't have people who threaten to keep my grandchildren from me when they don't get their way." Rebecca's face contorted with anger. "After everything we've done for you?" "The choice is simple," I interrupted. "We can have a relationship based on respect, or we can have no relationship at all. I've made my decision. Now you need to make yours." The silence that followed felt endless. I could see the calculations happening behind their eyes, weighing the money against their pride, weighing contrition against their anger. I waited, my heart breaking, but my resolve firm. Some lines, once crossed, change everything. This was one of them. It's been 6 months since I moved to Riverside Gardens, a modest senior community about 40 miles from my old home. My apartment is smaller, just 1 bedroom with a tiny balcony. But it's mine, completely mine. No one checking my bank statements, no hushed conversations that stop when I enter a room, no feeling like I'm a burden in my own home. The first month was the hardest. I'd wake up disoriented, reaching for the familiar bedside lamp that wasn't there anymore. But slowly, this place has become home. I have my morning routine now, coffee on the balcony watching the birds at my feeder, a short walk around the community pond, then either reading or working on the small herb garden I've started. Simple pleasures that remind me I'm still alive, still capable. Tuesdays and Thursdays, I volunteer at the community center. They call it the Financial Navigation Program, but really it's just me and 2 other retirees, Marge, a former accountant, and Hector, who worked in banking for 40 years, helping folks make sense of their finances. We see everything from widows who never managed money before to seniors being pressured by family members to help out with business ventures or home purchases. Yesterday, a woman named Eleanor came in, clutching a stack of papers. Her hands trembled as she explained that her son wanted her to take out a reverse mortgage so he could expand his landscaping business. "He says it's guaranteed money," she whispered, "but I don't understand these forms, and he gets so angry when I ask questions." I recognized that fear in her eyes, the same fear I'd lived with for too long. We spent 2 hours going through the paperwork, explaining the risks and discussing alternatives. By the end, Eleanor had decided to hold off signing anything and instead suggested a small personal loan that wouldn't put her home at risk. The relief on her face when she left reminded me why I do this work. It's not just about financial advice, it's about giving people permission to protect themselves. As for my own family situation, it's complicated. My son calls weekly now, careful and contrite. We're rebuilding slowly. He's in therapy, working through his own issues with money and control. I'm cautiously optimistic, but I keep healthy boundaries. Trust, once broken, doesn't mend overnight. My daughter chose a different path. After the confrontation and my move, she sent a letter saying she needed space to process. Translation: she's still angry. I didn't just go along with their plan. We've spoken twice in 6 months, brief, stilted conversations that felt more like obligation than connection. Last week, she declined my invitation to visit. It hurts, a dull, persistent ache that flares up at unexpected moments. But I understand that reconciliation can't be forced. The hardest lesson I've learned through all this is that protecting yourself doesn't make you selfish or paranoid. There's a difference between cynicism and wisdom. I don't believe everyone is out to take advantage of me, but I've learned to question, to verify, to trust my instincts when something doesn't feel right. Last Sunday at church, the pastor spoke about honoring your parents. It got me thinking about what respect for elders really means. It's not just about helping with groceries or calling on birthdays. True respect acknowledges autonomy, the right to make decisions, even unpopular ones, the right to say no, the right to change your mind. I'm 73 years old. I've earned the privilege of determining my own path, even if that path sometimes diverges from what my children want for me. That's not selfishness, it's self-preservation. And in preserving myself, I've found something I thought I'd lost forever: dignity.